I want to tell you all a story about a man born in a castle in 1877 deep in the mountains of Transylvania. It's a story about war, betrayal, spies, murder, mad science. And it all started with a little girl who came across a pile of bones. What do you mean it was a baron and not a count? I already did all this and it's October. Alright, yeah, because people are definitely going to watch a video about a Transylvanian baron, not a count. In 1895, a rich aristocratic girl named Ilona, a daughter of a member of the Hungarian parliament, came across some bones while she was digging on her family's estate. Now this was a time when scientists thought that Europe was pretty much devoid of dinosaur bones entirely. Ilona found something that would change the way that scientists look at fossils, evolution, and geology for the rest of time. A pathetically tiny hadrosaur skull. A hadrosaur is this thing, an enormous duck-billed plant eater. They were basically the cows of their time. The new species Ilona found would eventually be named Telmatosaurus. She gave the fossil she found to her older brother, who went by any of these names, though for the sake of the video we will go with Franz Nopcsa.
Through the years, I have been known by many names.
Nopcsa took the fossils to Professor Edward Seuss in the University of Vienna, where he expected they'd be taken in for study. However, due to lack of funding, he was turned away and told to study the fossils himself, which he did just that. Returning home, he spent much of the next 2 years in the library of Satchel Castle researching anatomy, physiology, paleontology, geology, neurology, and he returned to the University of Vienna 2 years later as a PhD student. In 1903, he wrote his dissertation, graduated summa cum laude, and received his doctorate. In the meantime, he identified those bones his sister gave to him as the very first dinosaur remains found in Hungary and changed the way that science looks at Europe. As a graduation present, he received a very respectable sum of money from his godfather, which he used to fund a fossil hunt on the island of Crete, which he did via chariot because he's just fancy like that. Now I'll be as brief as possible with the actual scientific discoveries this man made because Atlas Pro has already made a video, far better than I ever could, about the actual impact Nopcsa's discoveries had on the fields of geology and paleontology. And this video is much more about the life and times of a mad genius that history's forgotten about. So, a brief rundown of some of the scientific discoveries Franz Nopcsa is known for. He was an early adopter of the idea of continental drift theory. Wegener had only just proposed it and it wasn't really widely accepted by the scientific community at the time, so Nopcsa gave continental drift theory what it was desperately needing: evidence in the form of fossil remains found in several different continents which are nowhere near each other, remains of animals that could not swim or fly, implying that these continents were either much closer or connected when these animals were alive. He was also an early promoter of the idea that birds are descended from dinosaurs. The idea had existed for around 100 years prior, but while the scientific community at large was still debating whether or not it was true, he was studying the hip structure of alligators to see how flight could have evolved from a much more reptilian ancestor. He is considered the father of the field of paleobiology, the field of study in which fossils are not just analyzed to see what they would have looked like while they were alive, but why they looked that way. What conditions in their environments were they adapting to in order to evolve those specific traits? He was the first to understand that flight must have evolved completely separately and differently in both birds and pterosaurs. Both flying dinosaurs, sure, but animals that evolved from two very different sets of dinosaurs, one evolving flight from a four-legged dinosaur and the other flight from a two-legged dinosaur. We know now today that pterosaurs must have gotten off the ground much more like bats do than birds, galloping off the ground on all fours, which I didn't know that bats did that. That's pretty cool. Although for the most part bats are already in trees when they take off and they just dip over backwards. But if they were to take off the ground, apparently they quad launch is what it's called. And of course, Nopcsa's most known discovery is the concept of insular dwarfism. The idea that when isolated to an island, the big herbivores with lack of food will get smaller and smaller, and in turn their predators will get smaller and smaller, so communities of entire ecosystems on an island will eventually shrink in size. The other side of this coin is insular gigantism, but we won't get into that today. There are many known cases today of insular dwarfism, such as the tiny deer of the Florida Keys, the Sumatran tiger, and you may have heard of a recent news story of a chameleon found in Madagascar which, fully grown, could fit on the tip of your finger. And despite many examples of insular dwarfism existing, well, everywhere in today's world, on islands mainly, the process wasn't described until Nopcsa came across the Dinaric Alps, the section of the Alps that cover Croatia, Albania, and 70 million years ago looked a little bit more like this. This was called Hatseg Island, also known by its other nickname, the Island of the Dwarf Dinosaurs, linked to the Atlas Pro video in the description. Needless to say, Nopcsa was a wildly successful figure in the fields of paleontology and geology in his time. But wait a second. It's a story about war, betrayal, spies, murder, mad science. Wasn't this video about, like, murder or something? Yeah, we'll get there. Trust me. In Bucharest, Romania, in 1906, Nopcsa came across this man, Bazahid Elmas Doda, and that is where this part of the title comes into play. Though Nopcsa referred to Doda as his secretary, the two were very not so secretly a couple for the majority of their lives. Nopcsa has said, "He has been the only person who has truly loved me, and for in whom I had full confidence, never doubting for a moment that he would misuse my trust." Now, I understand that quote has been translated from Hungarian to English, but isn't it missing something? Like, the word not? Doda was not, in fact, Nopcsa's first homosexual relationship. In his youth, he had a fling with a Transylvanian count. Ha! So there is a Transylvanian count as a part of this story. However small a footnote. So small, in fact, he's not even named. Unfortunately, Romania's first legal same-sex marriage would not be until 100 years after Nopcsa and Doda first met. Their union might not have been legal, but they went everywhere together. Fossil hunts, war zones, any career path Nopcsa chose for them both. In sickness and in health, for rich or for poorer, yeah, we'll get there when we get there. In 1907, while fossil hunting around the mountains of Merdite, Albania, they were captured by the supposedly famous bandit Mustafa Lida, though I couldn't find any reference to this man on the internet outside of him kidnapping Nopcsa and Doda, meaning maybe he's simply famous for this one instance. Or perhaps in Nopcsa's memoirs, he didn't want to be captured by any random person, so he said that he was captured by some world-famous bandit, because any other bandit would be beneath him. What basically happened is Nopcsa and Doda had dinner with these people who they knew were bandits, went to sleep and woke up and were very politely informed that they were now prisoners. Which, well, duh. And you can learn a lot more about Nopcsa from this incident than you can about his captors. When captured, he said, "I informed Mustafa Lida that he had caught such a big fish that he would not be able to get it out of the water." Humble guy. From his description of the events, you can tell how he's an extremely detail-oriented person who was in no way shaken from the fact that he was being held captive for ransom and possibly being thrown in prison. We'll get to that in a bit. In his memoirs, Nopcsa writes, "Mustafa Lida was a portly fellow, but agile and quick in his movements. He seemed quite muscular. He had a large grey mustache, always entered the room with large, forceful strides, and hastened to take his seat, during which time all the rest of his men would rise to their feet. He was promptly served by his men. One of them took his socks off, and another brought water for him to wash his feet. Another man handed him his meter-long pipe and cigarettes, and someone else gave him a light. Mustafa Lida was taciturn and looked quite confident without having to say anything." Nopcsa's description keeps going on like that for a very long time, and it's uncharacteristically complimentary for someone who has taken you and your boyfriend prisoner. Apparently Lida was annoyed that the Sultan, no, not that Sultan, this Sultan, the Sultan had not made him a bimbash. Apparently that is a high-ranking member of the Ottoman military. And if you're like me and you don't quite see how kidnapping two scientists gets you promoted by the sovereign ruler of your country, that wasn't actually his goal at the time. No, he wanted to embarrass the Sultan, get word out that he had kidnapped these two people, have the Sultan send an army with ransom money to free them, and basically have him be embarrassed by the whole event. Nopcsa, however, convinced Doda to pretend to turn on him. He told Dota to say, well, my friend over there, he's kind of a famous international spy. And if you turn him in, you might actually get that promotion you're looking for. Instead of just embarrassing the Sultan, you could actually get something out of this and not ruin your life. Which, yeah, Nopcsa was very much a part-time spy. Relaying information he learned about the Albanian people and their culture in notes he wrote back to Austria-Hungary while he was in the mountains digging for fossils. I'll leave that up to your discretion on how much that constituted spy work, but he certainly seemed to consider himself very important because of it. Now, let's take a step back to deal with this situation. Transylvania was not a part of Romania at the time. It was actually a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Nopcsa spoke, well, a lot of languages, but his native language was Hungarian, and he was loyal to Austria-Hungary. Actually, in my research, I found evidence of him speaking, brace yourselves, Hungarian, Albanian, Romanian, Turkish, Russian, English, all fluently. Next came a bizarre couple of days in which both parties were pretty wary of one another, and they kind of went ahead with both plans at the same time, the ransom plan and the turn Nopcsa in as a spy plan. A relative of Dota's was actually in town at the time, and they chose him to be the one to inform the Turkish authorities that the two were prisoners and that a ransom needed to be paid. Side note, Nopcsa was armed the whole time. They never took his gun away. I understand Mustafa Leader was going for a whole gentle criminal thing where he was trying to be as polite to the people he captured as possible, but Nopcsa talks about all the times he considered shooting him in the face at every point throughout this. Could have happened. Now, Lita was obviously careful about going along with Dota's plan because that required him to trust people that he was holding against their will. But like I said, this wasn't the most normal or, dare I say, healthy relationship between Lita and his captives. Not in a Stockholm Syndrome way, just as in a all of these people were very narcissistic and trying to get something out of it. So Nopcsa was sent off to prison. Or, no, I read that wrong. It's a Prizren. Prizren. That's a city in modern-day Kosovo. Prizren, Kosovo. By then, Dota's father had heard of the news because, of course, instead of having anyone else tell the Turkish military that two people are being held captive, they got a relative of Dota's to do it. So he told Dota's father, who raised an army and tried to break them out himself. And he succeeded. Dota's father broke them out of Prizren with an army of 10 men and was going to kill Mustafa Lita. Nopcsa stopped him because he actually wanted the plan to go through at this point. Not because he actually cared whether or not Lita got his promotion, but because he wanted to solidify himself as an international man of mystery. He would get that reputation if he was arrested by the Turkish military and charged as an Austro-Hungarian spy. If you haven't noticed by this point, Nopcsa never felt like he was kidnapped. He went along with everything because it was fun for him, and you certainly don't get any notion of Stockholm Syndrome when reading his memoirs. More along the lines of, this low-life peasant needs my help. Alrighty then, I'll bite. What can the great Franz Nopcsa von Felső Szilvás do for you? Wow, I didn't actually expect the Bandit Saga to take that long. It's honestly one of the more minor details in this story, but it really builds up the character that we will be sticking with for the rest of this story. The two traveled, first living together in London where Dota came down with a bad case of the flu. Then for a time they owned a home in Skrder, Albania. Oh, they did a lot of their traveling via motorcycle, by the way. No word on if Dota rode in a sidecar and chased off seagulls with an umbrella. The following is a quote from Google Translate because I do not speak Hungarian. They traveled the countryside, not only mastered the Albanian language, but learned all the various dialects. Nopcsa described them, recorded the songs and tales of the Albanians. He recorded their dances, he did geological and meteorological research, he did cartographic surveys, taking plenty of photographs. Nopcsa is the first to have created a detailed geographical map of northern Albania in his 1911 book, which is an often referenced text in historic and ethnographic studies of the region. While living in the mountains of northern Albania, Nopcsa took up the Albanian independence movement as it was still owned by the Ottoman Empire at this time. He gave grand firebrand speeches and smuggled weapons into the country. In 1912, the independence movement succeeded. What followed was a very tumultuous time, the First and Second Balkan Wars, fighting to keep Albania an independent state from the surrounding nations. Franz Nopcsa, in his infinite narcissism, thought that his Contributions to the Albanian independence movement, sure. His writings, his status as a member of the aristocracy, categorized him as a surefire candidate for the newly opened position of King of Albania, a country he had only resided in for about 5 or 6 years at this point. Nopcsa suggested to the Austro-Hungarian Army Chief of Staff that he would marry a rich American girl to solve Albania's financial problems after they made him king.
This is my boyfriend.
Baron Franz Nopcsa von Felső Szilvás.
This is
Franz's
boyfriend.
Bajazid Elmas Doda.
Hey!
The exact quote, and these are his real words: "Once a reigning European monarch, I would have no difficulty coming up with the further funds needed by marrying a wealthy American heiress aspiring to royalty, a step which under other circumstances I would have been loath to take." I really don't think 1918 was that progressive. And while I very much wish we were living in the reality in which Nopcsa, Doda, and their rich American war profiteer became the king, queen, and first secretary of Albania, we unfortunately live in the bad timeline. Side note, they ended up going with a guy whose name is Zog. Zog the First. I just thought that needed to be stated. Ancient Uruk had Gilgamesh. Egypt had Ramses II. Macedonia had Alexander the Great. Rome had Julius Caesar. France had Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. Even neighboring Transylvania had Vlad the Impaler. Albania had Zog.
Kneel before Zog.
Nopcsa would go on to complain about being passed over for King of Albania for basically the rest of his life. Dejected, they plundered the mountains of Albania both together and separately until coming together to serve in Kosovo on the Austria-Hungary side of the First World War. And then, when the world needed him most, he vanished. Presumably Doda had an idea where Nopcsa was, but his family didn't. He went undercover as a shepherd in Romania during the First World War as a spy for the Austro-Hungarian army. So yeah, he did work as an actual spy for a number of years. I imagine off of the reputation he gained as a spy from the kidnapping incident, because he wasn't really a real spy before that, just an informant. There's a difference. But he always considered himself a real spy, went to great lengths to have people believe it, and now he's in the big leagues. Now, I hate to break this to you, but Austria-Hungary would go on to lose the First World War, and Nopcsa would then find himself in Soviet-controlled Budapest with a reputation for being a spy for a country that no longer existed to protect him. Hungary had an interesting time in the immediate aftermath of World War I, going through several governmental changes in a very short number of years. One of the shortest of these governments was the Hungarian Soviet Republic, which only lasted 133 days in the year 1919. And it was during this time where Nopcsa found himself desperately trying to flee the country to Vienna, Austria. Austria, another new nation in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, but a far more stable one, not controlled by people who want him dead. So Nopcsa falsified documents that said he was to be immediately brought before the People's Commissar, basically the military, which, is this another case of him purposefully turning himself in as a spy? I don't know, I couldn't actually find information on what he said, just that whatever he said in these documents, they were immediately like, okay, you're going to the military right now. So a small two-plane seat was commissioned to take him to Sopron, where the People's Commissar headquarters was at the time. In his bag, he carried only a new manuscript he had been writing, some jewelry, because you can't look dab at your execution date, and a revolver. What is with absolutely no one ever checking this man for a gun? Look how many pockets I have. This is just a cosplay of what he was wearing. He had more pockets than this. Also known as the knife and axe. Did they take those either? I doubt it. When the plane reached Győr, wherever that is and however you pronounce it, he put a pistol to the pilot's temple and told him to make a hard left to Vienna. This marked the very first recorded plane jacking in history. One of the most impressive firsts to Nopcsa's name, and that's saying a lot. See, and this is what I mean when I say this man was the real-life LGBT Indiana Jones. He somehow lived a life in which every political leader of his time hated his guts, but he had a particular set of skills that just allowed him to get out of every situation. So, after many years and several wars under their belts, the two, Nopcsa and Dota, settled down when Nopcsa got offered a job as head of the Geological Institute of Hungary in Budapest in 1925. Yes, Budapest, the very place he had stolen a plane from and fled 6 years earlier. It was under new management. Anyway, Nopcsa needed a job, for the first time in his life, because World War I had stripped him of his family's land, money, and titles of nobility. So now, he's not even a baron, let alone a count. Are counts higher on the rank than barons? I don't know. I'll have to look that up.
Yes.
Nopcsa finally flexed his many scientific credentials and got himself a job in the scientific field. Yeah, I know, I'd rather get thrown in prison too. And it seems Nopcsa agreed with me, as this job lasted a whole 2 years before the two were back out again, motorcycling through Europe collecting fossils. And they did this until they ran out of money entirely, and that whole dream and chapter of their lives came to a sudden halt. They ended up having to sell their entire fossil collection to the Natural History Museum in London. Afterward, the two decided to retire from fossil hunting for good this time, and the story comes full circle as Nopcsa decided to teach at the University of Vienna, where this whole thing began. He wasn't exactly young anymore. In 1928, Nopcsa gave a lecture in a wheelchair, stricken with an illness that would last him the rest of his life, though the severity waxed and waned. The juxtaposition between him in his youth and him now was striking. When he was younger, he was known to disappear for months at a time from his rich family estate, and appear dirty and in peasant clothes at the doorstep of some rich aristocrat who knew his family, asking for food. Now he was more known for chasing peasants off his lawn with a pistol. He was only in his 50s, by the way. Sure, that was old for back then, but not necessarily you kids get off my lawn old. The last thing Nopcsa would find himself researching is ways to prevent earthquakes. In 1932, he found himself in pretty bad health, making that health all the worse by motorcycling the 6,000 kilometers up and down the Italian coastline. It seemed as though his hedonistic lifestyle had caught up with him. He spent years alienating his friends in the scientific community by stunts like writing a paper on continental drift without crediting Wegener at all, or really not crediting anyone about anything because he thought himself to be the smartest person in the room, and why would he credit other people when all the ideas were, of course, his and his alone? He had to go out of his way to label himself an international spy because it sounded cool to him, making sure no still existing nation would see him as anything but an enemy. His home of Transylvania was incorporated into Romania, they didn't like him, and his adopted home of Albania, well, they didn't accept him as their king, and he never forgave them, and he was too proud to ever go back. And to top it all off, his very existence was illegal in the vast majority of countries. Still is in all these places today, which, yikes. But he wasn't alone. No. His full-time companion, his forever secretary, with him through thick and thin for the last 30 years of his life, the most loyal friend and companion anyone could ever ask for, was still by his side. And here's where I give the viewer an option. You can stop watching this video right now and come away from this that this was a story of a wrongfully forgotten genius whose scientific contributions were shunned by the world and forgotten due to his narcissism and his sexual orientation. Or take the red pill and shatter that illusion entirely. It certainly ruined the whole story for me when I found out this is how it ends. Back home in Vienna, Dota was staying out with men he met in bars until very late at night, and spending Nopcsa's money like there was no tomorrow. And, of course, the day that there would be no tomorrow came. On the morning of April the 25th, 1933, 2 weeks after an exhausted and sick Nopcsa came back from his earthquake research in Italy, Dota was nursing a terrible hangover, to which their housekeeper made them tea, and Nopcsa made sure to take it to Dota himself, not before slipping in powdered anesthetics to help the man sleep it off. Nopcsa wrote a letter to a colleague of theirs and asked the housekeeper to bring it to him at around 10 a.m., leaving the unconscious Dota and Nopcsa in the house together. That wouldn't be the last letter Nopcsa wrote that day. He took out a gun and held it to the temple of his longtime friend, companion, and secretary, just like he had done before to the pilot of the plane he hijacked in Budapest. But this time things went a bit differently. He fired. He sat down, started typing. He typed, "The reason that I shot my longtime friend and secretary, Mr. Bahazid Elmas Doda, in his sleep without him suspecting at all, is that I did not wish to leave him behind sick, in misery, and without a penny, because he would have suffered too much." Wow. He really thought Doda's suffering without him around would be so unbearable. So terrible that he would be better off dead. From what I can tell, the only sickness he's referring to is maybe alcoholism? Nopcsa was the one who was actually sick and dying at the time. Doda was having a pretty good life off the money and success of his 11 years older partner. They had money. Doda was not dying. And he certainly clearly had others who wanted him as their secretary. Nopcsa simply wrote this to justify his terrible actions, more to himself than to anyone else. And he needed to justify those actions to himself so that the last thing he ever did, in his mind, wouldn't be horrible. Because he immediately picked up that gun, put it to his own temple, and fired. Such a waste. Such a sour note to end this otherwise epic tale of a forgotten, misjudged, understood genius. But no, just none of that. None of that's true anymore. So that's the real reason Franz Nopcsa's story has been lost to history. It's because it's really awkward. Really incredibly awkward to talk about. Going into this, I thought I had uncovered a gem, right? A wrongfully forgotten hero of both science and history. I'm not the only one either. Here is Tom Holland's Twitter post where he thought he was bringing light to a wrongfully forgotten, misunderstood early hero of the LGBT community. And here are his Twitter followers pointing out that he had just praised a murderer. He was not completely forgotten about, though. He published over 150 scientific papers throughout his life. The paleontology, geology, biology communities, they all know who he is. He is still thought of in Albania as a national hero. He was given a posthumous honorary citizenship of Shkodra, Albania in 1992, and a place in Tirana, the capital of Albania, was named after him in 2008. Seemingly no mention of Doda, though. You know, Bahazid Elmas Doda, the man who fought 3 wars, spent his life digging in the dirt, helped uncover dozens of species that had never been before known to science, was probably a genius scientist in his own right, but any discovery he ever made would have gone straight into the works of the man, who would have never seen him as an equal, after 30 years together, even on their last day. This has been History Science Theater. Alright, fine, yeah, because people are definitely going to watch a video about a Castlevanian bear. Castlevania. That's a video game franchise. A Transylvanian Baron, okay, because yeah, people will definitely watch a video about a
Castlevania.
Alright, yeah, because people are definitely going to watch a video about a I didn't take it off that time, at least. Alright, yeah, because people are definitely... Alright, yeah, because people are definitely going to watch a video about a Castlevania...
Why are you saying that?
Transylvanian. Let me just say Transylvania a few times. Transylvania. Transylvanian. Transylvanian Baron, not a count. You know what? Screw the sword. That's too awkward to hold any longer. You saw the picture, he's got a sword in the picture, I don't need to keep holding on to that. And then, when the world needed him most, he vanished. Okay, yep.